Well, first I wanted to say thank you for the organizers and doing all the behind the scenes stuff, and especially Matthew for facilitating this discussion and for people for actually coming. I don't think anyone would come. And I guess I just wanted to say that my talk today sort of came out of my dissertation that Matthew kindly mentioned, wherein I began looking at Mark Fisher and the concept of capitalist realism. And then I wanted to develop a concept of post-capitalist realism, but I found Mark Fisher to actually be insufficient in providing me the tools to do that. And so I ended up talking about Marcuse as well. And it was really interesting actually seeing the sort of similarities between Mark Fisher and Marcuse in the way in which so much of what Mark Fisher talked about, Marcuse already did and did it better. But that's just my little spiel about Marcuse and Fisher. And so I wanted to discuss a brief history of capitalist realism because it's something that I wanted to look into during my dissertation, just out of sheer curiosity. And I actually found it as an interesting way of thinking about both Mark Fisher, but also capitalism and capitalist realism. So in 1963, Düsseldorf, West Germany, Reichte and Lug, sorry for the mispronunciations if anyone speaks German. So both of them staged an art action in 1963 in Germany called Living with Pop, a demonstration for capitalist realism. Actually, am I able to share my presentation by any chance? It's mostly just photos, so it doesn't really matter.
You should be able to do that. I just need, Caleb, are you there?
I can't share my screen.
Yeah, I'm here. Hit the share screen. It's the green button at the bottom. If you hit that, you should be able to.
Cool, got it. Thank you. Great, so it's right there. So yeah, they staged this art action called a demonstration for capitalist realism. And so as you can see by the photo, was set in a department store, and the artists immersed themselves in over 100 furniture displays, modeling the quotidian domestic living patterns. So like making the bed, looking in the refrigerator and watching television. The artists transvalued pop art, bringing to the fore its flaunting of consumer culture, mass production and commercialization. And during the same year in Tokyo, Japan, Agassigawa Ginpei produced single-sided monochrome prints of a 1,000 yen note. And as a side note, this print actually led to the prosecution of Agassigawa for money imitation. So in the following year, in 1964, Agassigawa's manifesto, Thesis on Capitalist Realism, proclaimed that for capitalist realism, or what he called shit realism, there's no great difference between real things, honmono, and imitations, naizmono. So the former is merely a dictatorial system which forcibly asserts itself as a real thing. I find it peculiar that the term capitalist realism was coined simultaneously yet independently in both Germany and Japan. So both coinage subverted socialist realism, the prevalent mode of realism at the time, that naturalistically depicted everyday life in the Soviet Union for a capitalist equivalent. So here are some examples that I've included of socialist realism. So one is by Piotr Konchalovsky and the other by Ilya Mashkov. And so yet the subversion of socialist realism by the two respective artists was not the artistic and political embrace of capitalism, nor the denouncement of socialism. It was a ridicule of both. So Reichte and Lug redefined their interpretation of pop art as a parallel propagandistic effort to socialist realism, while Agassigawa pointed to the analogy between capitalist and socialist representation systems. In these two cultural scenes, capitalist realism represented the truth of the form of appearance, not the essence of the capitalist present. But despite their particular conditions and absolute independence from one another, the two exhibitions in Germany and Japan nevertheless produced an eerily analogous critique of capitalism, that is, of its mystifying, abstract, fetishistic, and conceited self-representation. It could even be inferred that the simultaneity of both the timeliness and the motive of these exhibitions speaks to the universalizing tendency of capitalism. And I'm here reminded of Vivek Chiba. So 20 years later, in 1984, America the term re-emerged anew, but with a slight difference in intent. So the coinage of the term went beyond the realm of art and into the realm of cultural studies. In Advertising the Uneasy Persuasion by Michael Schutzen, a chapter on advertising as capitalist realism, in a similar gesture, subverted socialist realism. This time, however, not for the purpose of ridicule, but to denote advertising as propaganda, specifically for the promotion of consumer culture and capitalist values. Yet capitalist universalizing tendency was not the only conditional possibility for both the coinage of this term or its critique in these three different social political contexts. It was equally the aesthetic dominance and political presence of its opposite, socialist realism, which I've just mentioned. So the existence of socialist realism ignited the theorization of capitalist realism in all three instances by way of the same subversive gesture. Today, however, with a radically different political landscape, most notably the end of socialist and communist counter-hegemony, the echo of socialist realism is inaudible. So we're in the 1960s, realism was largely synonymous with socialist realism. Today it is capitalist realism that reigns. Its socialist counterpart has been wholly obliterated. So with the disappearance of socialist realism, capitalist realism became naturalized. Alas, this victorious naturalization led to its own insidious disappearance. Not only did capitalist realism supplant socialist realism, but it did so in a way which made capitalists ubiquitous and invisible. Whereas socialist realism was explicit about its political commitments, capitalist realism was diffused into the ambience of everyday life. No longer was capitalist realism a particular type of realism, it was realism in itself. So in other words, all realism became capitalist. Yet the realism of capitalism, as enunciated by previous coinages, does not represent the unmediated essence of reality. On the contrary, capitalist realism mystifies and obscures reality, representing not the truth, but the form of appearance of reality from the standpoint of capitalism. So it is this renewed form of capitalist realism which Mark Fisher coins in 2009 in England, and his infamous capitalist realism is the alternative. In developing the concept, Fisher was well aware that his concept was not an original one. He mentions both the German artist and Schutzen, though not Akasegawa, and in this manner of acknowledgement, the new coinage is differentiated from the old by placing an emphasis on the expansive nature of his own concept. So as Fisher contends, capitalist realism no longer defines an artistic practice nor an advertising function. Today, it gives a name to the pervasive yet invisible atmosphere in which, and this is a quote, capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizon of the thinkable. So any attempt to propose alternative horizons that transcend capitalism are either dismissed as naive utopianism or recuperated into the existing state of affairs. At the same time, actually existing past alternatives are either forgotten or denigrated. And this historical amnesia, as well as the grip of capitalist realism, is attested to even by the reception of Fisher's own concept. So despite his implicit subversion of socialist realism akin to the former coinages, the reference is no longer heard as it once was in the 60s and the 80s. Fisher himself actually makes this point in a talk entitled The Demonstration of Capitalist Realism, which you can find on YouTube if you Google it. So stated above, all realism is now capitalist. And the contemporary concept, that is the capitalist realism as coined by Mark Fisher, has herein transformed into designating, and this is another quote, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable and political economic system, but that also that it is now impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. So in escaping the confines of aesthetic and advertising realms, capitalist realism instituted a reordering of political, social, economic, and psychic life. A reordering which set all the present and future possibilities on the terms of the established order, that is, on the terms of capitalism. Or to put it more briefly and perhaps dramatically, following Slavoj Žižek and Frederick Jameson, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Yet the power of capitalism to stamp its imprint upon the whole consciousness of the human being is not a novel phenomenon, nor an original contribution to the critique of capitalism. To name a few thinkers who've contributed extensively to this question are Louis Althusser, Roland Barthes, Guy Debord, Antonio Gramsci, Georgi Lukács, and of course, Marx. The brilliance of capitalist realism, both as a text, the book that's on the presentation slide, and as a concept, is that it gives a renewed language for the contemporary conditions of capitalism, namely the organization of work in the 21st century, and more pressingly, the cultural and psychic foreclosure of alternatives to capitalism. And understanding the history of the term capitalist realism only reaffirms Fisher's own analysis. So where in the 20th century it stood as an artistic counterpart to socialist and communist alternatives, today it stands completely alone. So the sort of loneliness that's come to absorb everything around it. But in the spirit of Gramsci, who has once proclaimed pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will, this brief history of capitalist realism not only demonstrates the evolution of capitalism as an invasion into every corner of our lives and our psyche, but it also serves as a reminder that if alternatives used to be imaginable and even hegemonic, so too can they be imaginable and realistic today and in the foreseeable future. Capitalist realism is hence not only simply to be equated with Mark Fisher's formulation, but keeping this history of the term in mind allows us to recognize that capitalist realism always functions against its opposite, that is non-capitalism, either as a reactionary or assimilatory project. So in other words, it has and does contain with itself a negativity, something which stands against it and makes possible its own negation. And I think this point is often missed when people talk about capitalist realism today. Capitalist realism does not simply function as a blockage to imagining a world beyond capitalism, but it constantly integrates, it subsumes anti-capitalist imaginaries and practices into itself. So it's not that imagining capitalist alternatives to capitalism is a complete impossibility, but rather imagining alternatives to capitalism that can withstand absorption, integration into capitalism. So socialist realism once presented such a challenge to capitalist realism, which is why it was possible to integrate social realism into capitalist realism. So except for the subversion of the term itself, capitalist realism for socialist realism, the artistic form and style was completely different. So hence there's a possibility for formulating a realism today, perhaps a post-capitalist realism, which is what I wrote about in my dissertation, which stands against capitalist realism and remains unabsorbable and unassimilatable. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. That was stunning. Really, really, really cool. I just open the floor up to any questions or comments or those curious mixtures of both that seem to often come out of these kind of things.
Yeah.
Chamsi.
Hey, thanks, Vanessa. I really enjoyed that. It was really just full of great stuff. I was interested in why you found Marcuse so interesting. It was funny because we were talking about him today, and I was just remembering One-Dimensional Man and just how incredibly out of touch that was. That it was written at a time just before the explosion of the 60s, and he was talking in these ultra pessimistic ways, right? Totally administered society, recuperation of all dissent, this sort of thing. And I thought in a way it's sort of gloomy and not very finger on the pulse or something. So I was just interested in what you found so good about that.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because my experience of reading One-Dimensional Man was not one of pessimism. It was actually very optimistic. And it's interesting because usually people accuse Adorno of that, right? Oh, he's a complete pessimist, whereas Marcuse is always the optimistic one. But I guess what I did find interesting in Marcuse, as opposed to Mark Fisher, is that he just provided a much more extensive and I think convincing argument for how and why it is that capitalism absorbs any form of alternatives or any form of resistance into itself in a way that becomes effective, in a way that completely diminishes our ability to think about anything else, any other alternatives or any even negative critiques of capitalism, right? We become so satisfied with capitalism because it's so good at just providing us what we want, both on a psychic and cultural and economic level. So I think that's why I find it really interesting. I think his engagement, Marcuse's engagement with Hegel, also provided a really interesting and insightful conceptual way of thinking about our situation, as opposed to Mark Fisher, who kind of just almost sometimes replicates what Zizek says, or Jameson, which is fine. But yeah, I guess I found Marcuse more convincing. And also there was something to Marcuse's work that allowed me to actually see alternatives, whereas sometimes capitalist realism sort of reproduces capitalist realism, like the book Capitalist Realism reproduces the concept capitalist realism.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question.
And I guess that there is, you know, there's sort of, for Marcuse, there's still an outside, right? Eros and art. You know, there is
Precisely.
Yeah. No, that's right.
Yeah, exactly. I think Marcuse actually gives us the sort of language and the concepts to think about alternatives, whereas Mark Fisher doesn't really do that much. And that, speaking from a research, they try to find those things that looks at Mark Fisher not just being the sort of capitalist realism pessimist, but also who wants to think about alternatives and post-capitalist desire. But there's actually been a recent publication, I think last month, which has collected his lectures and his unpublished works, where Mark Fisher theorizes and discusses post-capitalism and post-capitalist desires. So I'd be interested to read that and how it also relates to Marcuse and the Frankfurt School.
Thank you.
Really interesting, and I imagine that the answer to this is probably that I need to read your dissertation. But I wanted to ask you a bit about sort of how we should understand the concept of post-capitalist realism, and perhaps more specifically, why realism? Why hang on to that to realism, given that it functions certainly in Fisher's work as this kind of appearance of something becoming sort of naturalized and commonsensical, but also serves this sort of mystifying function in the process. So I just wondered if you could comment on that. Really interesting.
Cool. It feels like it's been years since I've written my dissertation, and everything I wrote is just completely out of my head. But to answer that question, to answer one of those questions, which is why realism, I mean, there's so many debates about it, which I haven't quite really read as much as I wanted to during my dissertation. But the reason I wanted to hold on to it is I think it's important because realism allows us to situate ourselves within reality, within the existing reality, in the way in which that reality can provide us the tools and the pathways to go forward and to go somewhere else, as opposed to sort of reflecting on reality from outside, which doesn't really exist. So like when, and I guess this is kind of like a very simplified debate, but when people sort of posit an ability to think about alternatives from not the present, but like, oh, let's imagine a completely different world and the way in which we can reflect on our existing world from that completely different world, but it can never be separated from where we are today and where we stand. And so I think realism lets us situate ourselves and remind ourselves that we are where we are today, and a lot of those things have provided us the ability to think about something else. So it's kind of like immanence, right? It's like thinking about a future from within, from where we are. I don't know if that sort of answers your question. Yeah, and oh, sorry.
Yeah, it becomes sort of tautological though, doesn't it? Because I mean, you reference the fact that to look for a a non-capitalist future that doesn't itself fold back into capitalism is the problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's not a question, just an observation. So it becomes such a difficult thing to unravel, and how many theorists have tried to do this? Harvey and all the rest of it. It sort of just becomes a really difficult thing to try and imagine capitalism when you are doing that from within that perspective of we can only know what we know, so yeah, exactly. Really interesting presentation, really interesting presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right, does anybody else have any questions for Vanessa?